Yep, we'll do cheers. Okay, good morning and welcome to this next session at AusCert 2022 Day 2. My name is Valdemar Jacobson from Business Aspect and I'm your chair for this session. This session is by Jamie Zajac from Recorded Future, talking about 5 ways to optimize your SOC.
All right, thank you very much. Just a quick reminder, there are 2 extra seats up here. So if anyone wanted to take these, they're comfortable, they're available, but that's up to you, your choice. So good morning, Jamie Zajac. Nice to meet you all. I am from Recorded Future. I run product management there. But today I'm not talking about Recorded Future. I'm just going to talk more generally about 5 ways to optimize your SOC. So first I'd like to start with what is the problem that we're actually trying to solve by having a SOC in general. And the thing is that what's happening is cybersecurity is becoming more and more of a requirement for every company. Gartner estimates that in the next couple of years, 40% of companies, publicly traded companies, are going to have a dedicated cybersecurity committee at the board level. So there's a lot of money pouring into security, a lot of awareness pouring in for companies saying, right, I have to do something about this. This is a threat to my business. This is a real problem, something I have to actually deal with. So that's good for us as cybersecurity professionals because the business is finally starting to realize what we do is important, what we do is essential. But it also puts a lot of pressure on us that we're now given these really high expectations. I want you to protect me from everything. I want you to keep my business running. These really lofty, ambitious goals that cybersecurity professionals are now handed. So there's more and more pressure being put on the team. There's more and more need that we need to deliver. I like to look at what we're trying to do in cybersecurity. I use the analogy of driving. If we think about driving, it's an inherently dangerous task. Right? We're in these small vehicles that, although they're designed to be safe, they're really susceptible to a pothole in the road, some rocks, to something happening. When we're driving, we're going down the motorway at 100, 110, 150, depending on your speed of choice, kilometers per hour. We're going really fast, just a few feet apart from other vehicles that are doing the same thing. Everyone on the road has a different priority. Some people are just trying to look cool in their car. Some people are trying to get somewhere really fast. Some people are trying to take in the view. We all have different priorities. We all have different ways that we're trying to get there. So it's a challenging, dangerous environment to drive. And there's no one solution to make driving safe. Right? You can't just simply drive slower. Right? On the motorway, it's actually more dangerous to drive slowly than it is to drive at the speed of traffic. You can't simply put your car on autopilot. Right? There's been numerous accidents that have happened by that. There's no one tool. Just wearing your seatbelt won't protect you. Just buying a safer car won't protect you. There's no silver bullet. So, how do we make driving safer? Right? We all do this every day. Well, we maintain situational awareness. We know what's around us when we're driving. Who's the car trying to pass us, coming by? Where's the exit that we're trying to get to? Second, we make a plan. We know where we're going to get to. What exit do I need to take? What lane do I need to be in to get there? So we make a plan and we try to follow that plan. And then finally, we understand that no matter how good of a plan we make for our driving, we have to adapt and overcome. When all of a sudden a car cuts you off, when perhaps an animal is in the road, or perhaps you get a notification that there's a police officer ahead running radar, you need to slow down. We quickly adapt and overcome to the environment. It's really the same in cybersecurity. There's no one silver bullet solution that we can implement or buy that is going to protect us from everything. We have to build a plan. We have to try to align priorities in an environment where everyone has a different goal that they're trying to accomplish. And no matter what we plan for, something changes. Either the threat landscape changes, something gets in our environment, so we have to adapt and overcome. So I use the analogy of driving to represent cybersecurity and to represent the way that I think we can be better. We have to have a plan, we have to adapt and overcome. So I'm going to talk today, because the SOC and because security teams have more and more pressure on them, I'm going to talk about how can we make our SOC team a little bit more efficient. How can we deal with some of these challenges that we're facing? I am going to start with some assumptions. No 2 companies are exactly the same. No 2 companies have exactly the same priorities, the same goals, the same budgets. So when I speak about ways here, I'm going to make a few assumptions about the type of business I'm looking at. First, I'm going to assume that this is a medium to large size business. So someone that has an actual team here, they have some assets they're trying to protect. I'm going to assume that there's a SOC that's established. So I'm looking at ways to optimize a SOC versus implement a SOC. Though you can certainly take these lessons and think about them if you're starting a new team or starting some new tooling or new project from the start. And I'm also going to assume that there's a kind of general set of tooling already in place. So I'm going to assume you already have a firewall in place. You have some sort of endpoint protection in place, some sort of monitoring. I assume that you already have a SIEM in place. So again, whether you are in that spot or not, that's kind of the spot I'm jumping into to give us a baseline of what we're going to talk about. All right, final rule. I do have one rule for all my presentations, which is that it doesn't end until people ask 3 good questions. So I have instructed them to lock the doors in the back. I know it's a very bad fire hazard, but I really encourage 3 questions. If you want to ask them as we go, that's totally fine. If you want to wait till the end, that's fine too. You can raise your hand, you can yell it out. I listen really well, and we'll go from there. But I love the participation if we can get it. All right, so 5 ways here. So the first one, the SOC team is responsible for an overwhelming amount of data flowing into them. Pretty much every system, every log, every alert from another application that's generating alerts, they all tend to flow into the SOC. So the first recommendation I have is to think about the data that's flowing in. If you have garbage coming into the SOC, you're going to have garbage coming out. Now, the SOC team is oftentimes seen as a team where we have a compliance requirement that we need to monitor this data. We need to have log files retained. We're going to throw it into a SIEM. We're going to give it to the SOC. I can personally attest as an application developer, or former application developer, which I realize probably makes me hated by many of you, but that's okay, that I've done this myself. I've had a compliance requirement. I've said, well, we'll just throw it into a SIEM. We're all good. The SOC will run some rules. If anything bad happens, they'll let us know. We're good to go. I've grown older and wiser to realize that simply throwing logs into a SOC is not a solution. It's a compliance checkbox, but it hasn't actually solved any problems. So over time, I've learned, well, how do we get out of the situation where we're not just throwing everything into the SOC and then hoping that you guys will magically alert the application teams and the business team to the problems? Well, it requires first thinking about what's coming into the SOC, right? Garbage in equals garbage out. So one way you can do this is by understanding what are all the sources of data that you're responsible for that are coming in. I suggest creating an inventory of everything that's coming into the SOC. Every log source, having some sort of wiki page or Confluence page or Google Doc or whatever your preferred technology of choice is for listing this, where you're able to list, this is the log source, this is the system it's coming from, this is the business owner of that system, this is who I go to if there's a problem, and this is what I'm responsible for looking for. Now the business won't be able to tell you, many application developers won't be able to tell you exactly what to look for, but you may say, what I'm looking for is, this is a firewall log, it's coming from our Singapore entity, and what I'm responsible for looking for is malicious traffic. Great. That's at least a starting point. You're looking for malicious traffic. It's a firewall log. It's for the Singapore entity. Maybe it supports a particular segment of the business that you can identify. Now, as opposed to having a generic log source, now you kind of have some context around it. So now when there's an alert fired on that or some sort of correlation detected, some sort of incident that you're investigating, you have a place to go to as your first step. What is that log source? What is the context around it? Who's responsible for it? And what am I supposed to be looking for in it? Is that within my remit and my role and responsibility in this organization? That works well if you're responsible for a log source, right? It's coming from this system, this is the owner, this is the context around it. Another big source of data into the SOC is oftentimes other teams or other systems might generate alerts that they feed into you. Maybe someone's running a secondary system or something that you're not responsible for managing the system, but they generate some sort of alerts within that. Maybe it's an identity and access management system that has some ruling or some tooling built in it that can generate anomalous traffic, anomalous logins. Maybe you don't get the raw logs. So the other part is to look at anything that's being generated as an alert outside of the SOC and being fed to you as an alert, and go through the same process. Great. If I'm getting an alert from the IAM system, what is that system? Who's responsible for it? What is the logic that's generating that alert? And what am I supposed to do with it? What is my responsibility around it? Am I responsible for just saying it simply exists? Thank you very much. Most likely, you're responsible for taking some further analysis or action on it. And so you can write that down and have a good understanding. So first we understand what's all the data coming in, what's the context around it, who's responsible for it. Then we can make sure that when we're feeding data out, after we've done our analysis and investigations, that we have that context around it. So garbage in equals garbage out. Good data in, you can help get good data out. All right, all good on number one. Move to number two. Number two is have a playbook. The best sports teams in the world, they aren't great because they just happen to have an amazing player or an amazing set of players. They're usually great and have winning records and win championships because they have a playbook. They have a way that they execute that sport. I was a former basketball player, and even at high school level basketball, we would practice what happens when there's 4 seconds left in the game, you're down 2 points and the ball's at the other end of the court. You had prescriptive plays, you would practice it. That's how you got good at executing, because it wasn't, a Hail Mary at the end of the game. It was something you'd practiced for. It was something you knew how to do. You had a playbook to follow. So having a playbook, it's no different when we're responding to an alert or an incident in a security investigation. Let's take an example here of, you just got an alert that says you have traffic going, through your firewall or through your WAF, through one of your systems, from an endpoint to a suspicious IP. So the question is, now what are you going to do? Regardless of the skill level in your organization, you want to have a written down plan that says how you're going to execute that. Many of you here are probably some of the rock stars in your SOC, or rock star incident responders. That's probably why you were chosen to come here today. You're like already 3 steps ahead of me. Like, Jamie, this is not a problem. I know exactly how to investigate that alert. I'm going to look at what system it's coming from. I'm going to know the context of that system. I'm going to look at how much traffic was it. I'm going to look at where that traffic's going. I'm going to look at the properties of that IP. Like, what's the problem? You're the rock star people here in this room, most likely. The problem is not everyone has the same skill level, the same experience, the same expertise. So writing down a playbook allows you to do a few things. One, it allows you to scale your team across many different individuals coming on and ramp up quickly. So regardless of a tier 1 or an expert analyst, you can have a similar process that people are following. 2, it allows you to respond faster. If you're relying on people to go through the analysis, each person might have a slightly different perspective on how they look at that, slightly different analysis. If you can have it written down, then you're allowing people to follow a more repeatable process that they can go through. So when you look at a playbook, there's kind of a few elements that you can go through. So one is I always think of scoping the incident first. What are the systems involved in that? And what are the details of that? Not all systems are created equal. If you see suspicious traffic to an IP from one endpoint device, and it's maybe a few packets, or if you see a lot of packets, maybe an exfiltration event to a suspicious IP from a production server where you're storing a lot of PII, which of those has higher priority to investigate? Now, they might both be important, but probably that production system that's possibly going through an exfiltration event is a higher priority. You want to look at that one first. So you need to understand the kind of nuances of the system there. These are things you can write down. Hey, the first thing we want to do is understand what system is it coming from. The second thing we want to do is understand how much traffic is it. The third thing is we want to look at the destination. I want to investigate certain aspects of that IP address. Where is it hosted? Why was it considered suspicious? What type of traffic is it? So you can write down a playbook that says this is the data you need to identify. This is the data you need to gather. These are the kind of pros or the nuances of the system that you need to investigate when doing this, and then follow that through. A best practice for writing a playbook is to avoid dead ends. This is really challenging because everything we do is not cut and dry. It's not like because this system talked to that IP, therefore it's bad and we need to take that system off the network. It's always more complicated than that, always. It's always, well, let me look a little bit further. So to whatever extent possible, the more you can get into the details to try to avoid a dead end at the end of that by documenting more questions, more data that you would go through, what's that next step, the more robust that playbook can be for someone to execute it. That's also a way that you can allow lower tier analysts to execute perhaps even higher level analysis because you've documented it for them to be repeatable. Now, it's not to say it's a panacea. Many of your playbooks will end with escalate to a tier 2, escalate to a tier 3, because sometimes things just get complicated. But the more that you can resolve at the lower levels, the cheaper it will be, the more efficient you'll be, and the more satisfied your team will be as well, and the better outcomes you'll drive for the business. So the second recommendation here is create a playbook. For every alert that's coming in, for everything you're responsible for triaging and analyzing, have a playbook written down that says what are the steps I'm going to execute and walk through to do that. All right, everyone still with me? The 3-question rule is still in effect, so if you have one, you can just raise your hand, you can shout it out, you can come sit in one of these chairs. It's up to you guys. All right, the third one is you need to drive focus within your organization. And just to be clear, you do not need a green Ford Focus. I promise you this will solve 0 of your problems. But this type of focus, this is where you're supposed to give a small laugh or a chuckle. It's in the notes that says that's what you're supposed to do. So I hope you guys, thank you. Someone, perfect. All right, you need to drive focus within the SOC. When everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. Right? It's a very simple saying, but it's quite true. So the question becomes, how do you actually drive focus within the SOC? How do you drive priority? The first is making sure that things that are fed in are actionable. So whenever you're investigating alerts, I like to always check, is this alert that I'm investigating leading to an outcome, or is it leading to a dead end or a false positive or nothing? As you identify things that are leading to false positives, you need to go back and tune the alerts. right? You can't just say, well, hey, that's constantly happening. We're just going to accept it. I think back to early in my career, I started as a system administrator. And the task that we had 10, 15 years ago was we would set up monitoring on basic hardware systems. And the example that everyone learned the hard way was monitoring for CPU. If the CPU percentage goes over 95%, send me an alert. I need to investigate that system. I might need to scale out another server. I might need to shut down a process. I need to do something, right? CPU is spiking. This is, for those of you younger people in the room, this is before the cloud. This is when we actually had to scale out physical systems in the world. And what we'd all learned the hard way was that at 2:30 in the morning, the SQL backup would run on the server. It would spike the CPU. We'd get an alert. We'd get woken up. And we would do absolutely nothing except let the SQL backup run. And so eventually we started tuning that alert, right? We'd say, well, if the CPU spikes to 95% for more than 10 minutes or more than 30 minutes, or if it's not between the hours of 2 and 3 in the morning, then alert me. We'd then get alerted during daylight savings, but that was only twice a year, so it wasn't a big deal, right? But that was how we worked. Eventually, we started really understanding how to tune those alerts. What actually matters? Was it duration? Was it time? Was it certain periods we would exclude? Did we exclude certain processes? You have to do the same thing with alerts that are feeding into the SOC. If we constantly let things come in and just ignore them as false positives, then we create alert numbness. We just always ignore it. We will miss something in the future. Taking the little bit of time, or sometimes a medium amount of time to go back to the root system and fine-tune those alerts will pay off in the end with better actionable alerts. The second is to prioritize and get buy-in from the business. What actually is a priority to the business? Now, you can't go ask that. Every business owner will tell you one of two things. Either it's all a priority, or one of three things. Either they'll give you a wrong answer that you just really shouldn't believe. Two, they'll tell you everything's a priority. Or they'll tell you, like, it's your job. Just protect me. Stop everything. Like, your job is to keep me out of the front page news. That's what I want. Those are really unhelpful answers to actually prioritize. So what I encourage is people who are leading the security team, leading the SOC, to be proactive about going back to the business with a recommendation, with trade-offs, with business language about how we can actually drive priority within what we're doing. So one way to do this is to try to speak in business language. This can be really hard to do, but let me give you an example. You might go and say, hey, looking at the threat landscape, I estimate we should be budgeting $500,000 to pay out a ransom this year because everyone around us is getting hit. That's what I think is the average payout for a business of our size based on some research or analysis you've done. So we should just budget for it. It's going to happen. And this is going to say, like, well, wait a minute. I don't want to just budget for paying a ransom. That's a horrible idea. It's like, all right, well, we have an option. We have a trade-off. We could implement a really good DR system, a really good EDR protection system, and it will help prevent that. That system will probably take us maybe $200,000 to buy, to implement, to get running. But we don't have to budget for the $500,000 of ransom because I think we'll reduce that risk considerably. Right now, we're actually talking about language that the business understands. I have a risk of $500,000 that I might have to pay. I have an option. I can pay $200,000 and retire that risk, or I cannot. Right? But now you're able to drive a priority around a project. Right? Now we're saying, hey, this is a project that's important. This is the cost to implement it. But this is how it's going to impact the business. That can be really uncomfortable, difficult conversation to drive, especially from within the security team. But I think that's how we as professionals help drive this within the business. This is the culture. This is what we need to do. And speaking the business language can help drive some of those priorities and trade-offs within the organization. It's not easy. It's not like the business is just going to say, great, here's $200,000, have a great day. But at least it gets you in the conversation about driving the solutions and being proactive in that conversation with the business. All right. Recommendation number 4 is to integrate and automate as much as possible. So in step 2, I said, great, if we start writing playbooks about how do we actually triage these alerts, what are the steps we're going to take, what are the system aspects we're going to look at, what's the information we're going to gather. If you can write the playbook, then you can ask yourself, can you automate the playbook? Automating playbooks for response really comes down to 2 things. One, do you have the playbook written down to automate? Because automating a bad process is just as bad as running a bad process. It's just doing it faster. So one, do you have a good process? Do you have a good playbook written? And then number 2, now it's just down to the technical skill to actually automate it. Which if you have a good playbook, the technical skill is usually the secondary. You might have a backlog of things that you're trying to get done, but it's usually not the most complicated part. So if you have a playbook, can you automate it? Can you get those steps taken automatically? One of the biggest challenges you'll run into with creating playbooks is, like I said, there's really no definitive answer. It's hardly ever guaranteed that this traffic or this process or this obscure thing I've seen in the logs is truly good or bad. That's why it's given to the SOC. If it was a hard fast, this is a bad process, it should be blocked, your EDR would block it, or your default firewall rules would block it. The reason why the SOC team is usually involved is because it's not cut and dry that this is good or bad. It requires you to provide a little bit of analysis and critical thinking and investigatory research or time into that. So bringing in threat intelligence can help you do that. It can help you understand, is this traffic to this IP? Give me more information about that IP. Has it previously been used in an attack? What type of malware is it associated with typically? Why is that considered suspicious? Okay, well, it's coming from this process running on this endpoint. Okay, well, it's a Windows 10 device. It's coming from SVC host.exe. Okay, what else should I be looking at to see if that's good or bad? Okay, well, that's associated with these types of malware, with these hashes, with these behavioral characteristics. Now I can keep going and investigating it. So bringing in some threat intelligence to your process gives you more information, more context to be able to progress that investigation faster and more confidently. Now, you might not be able to drive everything to an automated remediation system within your environment. That's the panacea. That would be great to automatically get an alert, investigate it, pull in the context, make a decision, resolve the ticket, execute remediation and resolve the ticket. That's where everyone wants to be. But one key step to get there is what I call auto-enriching events for your analyst. So if you have a playbook that says, right, the analyst needs to gather this information. They need to understand what system it's coming from, who's the user on that system. They need to understand these aspects of perhaps that IP. I mentioned kind of, is it associated with this malware? What processes should they look for? If you can pull all of that together into the ticket for the analyst, you've saved them a lot of time. As opposed to someone going to 3, 4, 5 different systems to investigate this, maybe open source websites, free tools, that people are using, try to see if they have an API. Can you call that and pull it into the ticket itself? Now the analyst is looking at all this in one place, and now they're taking exception when they're going out to these other tools. It's a lot faster, it's a lot more repeatable. And guess what? When you escalate that from tier 1 to tier 2 for more investigation, you have all of that work in one spot. So now you don't have the tier 2 analyst repeating that because they didn't trust the tier 1 analyst or because time's elapsed. They have it all in one spot. So if you can auto-enrich these events or these tickets, however you're sending that to your analyst, with more context, you've saved them a lot of time. You've made it more repeatable for the entire process. It can also be a great coaching experience. Now that you've got all this information in one spot, if you expected a lower level analyst to be able to handle this alert, you can go back and coach them. Say, hey, here's the information that was in the ticket. Why did you not understand this part, or why did you make that decision? Whereas if you're saying, like, why didn't you go to tool A or tool B, you'll end up with a lot of, like, I didn't have time, I didn't know it, I didn't know I was supposed to go there. So the more you can bring in, you can also help coach and grow your analysts so they can understand the better processes that they should be using, the better analytical analysis they should be executing, maybe some of the technical details, wherever it is that they might be getting lost. As part of integrating and automating, see how many systems you can tie into a SOAR. One of the hardest parts of implementing some sort of SOAR technology is having a playbook. And then another is getting the integration set up and stood up to each of the different tools. Perhaps you have a process where you're looking for leaked credentials from any of your employees. If their credentials have been leaked or stolen, you want to know about that and reset it. If you can use a system to automate that, to get the stolen credentials, to validate they're an active employee, and then maybe hook into your Active Directory or your Okta or whatever you're using as IAM system, if you can do that, you can execute a lot of automation through that. It's oftentimes a big challenge to get access to the tools. But again, pushing that this is a priority for the business because you've aligned with the business priorities can help you execute that and get the access and the permissions that you need to do this. And then my final part is, or maybe word of caution, is when you're thinking about automation, you need to understand the different systems and the impacts that they have. So one of my favorite examples is if we're looking at leaked credentials, and we're going to try to automate perhaps a forced password reset or a lockout process. It's the feature I call don't lock out your CEO from the company. And what this means is you need to understand that different employees or different systems have different rules. And you may not like that they have different rules, but they have different rules. Right? An e-com system versus an endpoint. You can lock out someone, if you lock out an engineer from their build system or from something like that for a few hours, they'll yell and scream. Of course, they'll complain. But if you take down your e-com system for 4 hours, that's a lot more painful to the business. So you do need to understand the nuances of these different systems and what the different impacts to the business are so that you have the right threshold there. And you'll get it wrong sometimes. That most businesses will accept that. But trying to understand those differences gives you a better confidence in what you're automating. Because you can always make an exception to say, hey, if it's the CEO, like open a ticket and I want an analyst to handle that manually, right? That's better than locking them out. But it's also better to have an exception for the CEO and the C-suite than it is to not move forward with automation at all. All right, and the final one is what gets measured gets managed, what gets managed gets improved. So you need to really measure everything that's happening within your organization, within your team. So there's a few places you can start to measure. First is measure the amount of alerts that are coming in and the amount of alerts that you're generating. Just looking at the volume, is it going up over time? Is it going down over time? Is it staying flat? It's a lot easier to go when you're saying, hey, I need to hire 2 more analysts next year. When you say, let me show you the alert volume we've dealt with over the past 12 months and how it's gone up 42%. That's a much more concrete conversation than, we're not keeping up with tickets, we're behind, we just need more analysts. Now it shows that you're really managing that part of the business. Look at this by source. If you have different business units that are responsible for feeding into your SOC or different teams, it's also really powerful to say, hey, I'd like to show you how many alerts we're getting from this team over here. Whether it's a geography or whatever that business unit organization that you have is, they're generating 80% of our load. Okay, well now the business can say, great, that team's going to pay for you to have another analyst, right? I'm going to take a little bit of their budget and maybe give it to you. Again, now you've got the data to help drive those conversations. And then what's your mean time to response? How many tickets are you actually getting to and how long is it taking you? This can give you a threshold to set improvements. Hey, we want to implement some programs to get our mean time to response or a number of tickets handled by analyst 1 up by 10% this year or improved by 10%. And these are some programs that we're going to talk about to execute to do that. Now you have some measurements to drive that. If you're creating playbooks, whether they're manual that you've written down or whether they're automated in some sort of tooling, you can measure the volume that they're being executed. This gives you a couple of things. One, are you automating the right things? If you have a playbook that's being run hundreds of times a month, that's a great candidate for automation. If you have a playbook that's being run once a month, that's probably a poor candidate for automation. You'll have a lower ROI on that. So measuring how often a playbook is being executed, whether it's a manual playbook that someone's walking through or whether it's an automated playbook, gives you that ROI essentially calculation right off the bat. You can try to measure the relevance. What I mean by relevance is how many tickets are you getting that are true positives that you're investigating and leading to a specific outcome or incident that you're investigating versus are false positives. I like to use effectively 2 different statuses on a ticket to do this. So I might have a status that says this ticket is closed, which means I investigated it and the incident's closed, or a status of maybe dismissed. And a dismissed might mean, hey, this was useless. I did nothing with this. It was effectively a waste of my time, or maybe something I didn't want to spend my time on. Or closed means it was actually a real thing. This gives me that ability to measure over time. How many tickets am I dismissing versus investigating and closing? And is that going up or down? If I want to drive actionability of the alerts coming in, if I want to tune them, having this metric gives me that ability to base that off of. And then just 2 more here. One concept I've used successfully is called a continuous improvement board, where you assemble a team. This can be maybe 3 or 4 people within your organization, hopefully different skill sets or different kind of diverse opinions. Could be a great analyst, it could be someone from the engineering team, someone from an analyst team, however you're organized. But create a board that meets maybe once a month, reviews these metrics, and then can come up with suggestions and recommendations on improvements. This way it's getting the best opinions hopefully from the team, getting the brain power of multiple people together. It can be a great way to drive improvement within your team, that you have some of your best analysts part of this continuous improvement board to review the metrics and suggest programs and improvements. This is where a lot of the good ideas will come from. Hey, if we automate this playbook, it'll drive this outcome. Or like, that sounds like great, but it's really hard. We should do this other one instead, and here's why. And you can have a team that's reviewing that month over month or quarter over quarter, whatever the right cadence is for your business to try to drive improvement. It requires having the metrics, but then you can have that team working on continuous improvement. And finally, the more you measure, the more you have the metrics to bring to executives that are asking you about things, whether it's how many tickets are we responding to, or is our risk going up, are we getting an ROI on this tool, why do you need to hire more analysts? Having the metrics there, because you're measuring stuff, the right stuff, gives you the ability to provide that up to them. I'm a big fan personally of managing up within my business. And so I proactively send out monthly reports on what my team's working on and what they're doing and what our metrics are each month. I'm not asked for it, but now I'm controlling the conversation, controlling the narrative up to that executive, so that by the time I'm asking for more resources in 8 months, they've heard it 8 months in a row and what the problem is. So now they kind of understand what the goal is. When I go to them at just the end, I get a really bad response. So I find that proactively sending out metrics shows that you're on top of your business as a SOC leader. And it also allows you to control the narrative up to your executives. And same thing if you're a CISO, if you're in charge of it, up to the CEO, up to the board, up to whatever that next level is there, giving them the metrics and visibility of what's happening. All right, this is where you're going to want to start preparing one of your 3 good questions. It's coming up very quickly. So remember, nobody gets to leave until we go through that process. So summary, the 5 things to think about. One is the SOC is responsible for so much data coming in, but if you're getting garbage in, you're going to get garbage out. So you need to understand, you need to inventory and document all the sources of logs and alerts coming into the SOC. Who's the owner? What's the context around that? Write down a playbook for each alert. What is the process that the analyst needs to go through? What's the system nuances they need to know? What's the data they need to gather to bring that in to make a decision? Drive focus within the business. If everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. So if you can tune the alerts that are coming in, you can have more focus. If you can identify some alerts as higher priority than others coming in, now you have a priority your team can work on. I would not like to allow that. Thank you. Automate and integrate as much as possible. If you have a playbook written down, ask yourself, can you automate it? Can you at least gather information and intel together to feed into that analyst to give them a central point of everything they need to look at? Use threat intelligence to try to bring additional context or try to make that decision as automated as possible. And then finally, what gets measured gets managed, and what gets managed gets improved. So you need to measure these key metrics within the business about how many tickets are you responding to, how many are leading to false positives, how many are actionable, how long is that taking, is the volume going up or down, what business unit is generating the most alerts. Measuring these things give you the metrics that you need to drive improvement within your team, within your organization, and drive the outcomes that you're looking for. So before we move to the final questions and the moderator comes up here, I just want to say thank you all for listening. It's always a pleasure to get to talk about this. I hope you found some relevance to it. If you want to look me up on LinkedIn or send me an email directly, I'm always happy to chat more directly about these topics. Or you can, of course, find us over at our booth later today as well. So I'll invite some questions, but otherwise, thank you very much.
After the conference, some lovely gin. And we do have
and some gin. Thank you very much.
So in the dying minutes, there turned out to be more questions than just my own. So of these, it's actually a couple more that just popped up as well. Okay, so based on your experience, what are the top 3 metrics that executives or boards are interested in from a SOC? Yeah, so top 3 metrics. Executives are always looking for the outcomes, not the raw volume. So usually they're looking for how many incidents did we have, how long did it take us to resolve it, and how much did that cost me? And it's really hard to get the how much did it cost me. One, but if you can get to some proxy metrics around it, you can usually get there pretty close. My own question, since somebody else seems to have liked it, rather than just the Siemens SOAR technologies, is it a dedicated incident response platform or a dedicated incident handling capability that's the key enabler for a SOC?
So I think it's always going to a little bit depend on the organization, what the right tool set is. I don't think there's any panacea tool. There's, maybe every vendor out there tells you that their tool will solve all your problems. I really think it's about understanding what are the threats to your business, what's likely to happen, and how are you going to respond to that with a good playbook. And I don't think there's a single tool out there that's the silver bullet. How do you deal with SOC fatigue? How do you deal with SOC fatigue? If people are wasting their time triaging false positive alerts, I think that's what leads to fatigue. And leads to just like, why am I here? What am I doing? I'm just getting worked harder. So what I encourage is try to work back to the source of what's generating those alerts that are coming in. If you can get actionable alerts in, then working in the SOC is actually a kind of interesting process because you're investigating crazy stuff that's happening in the world. If people are investigating false positives and silly alerts, that leads to fatigue. And then finally, if you can get the metrics so that you have a properly staffed team, or if you can automate the program so that you have a properly staffed and resourced organization, that can help as well. So that leads quite nicely into the next one. How many playbooks is too many? How many playbooks is too many? I would say if a playbook is being executed less than once a quarter, then it's probably a lower priority playbook. But that's going to depend on your volume. But it'll just get stale if it's not being executed.
And can you tell us about a playbook you've automated that worked really well?
A playbook that I've automated that works really well. I would say the most effective has been auto-enriching alerts. Trying to execute the full remediation has been really challenging from what I've seen from most people. But bringing together the intelligence as opposed to gathering it, I found to be the most effective because it can make the decision making much, much faster and give you a record over time of what's happening.
And that follows on to the next question that's just popped up. How do you optimize threat intelligence within your playbooks?
Optimizing threat intelligence. Trying to, as much as possible, get to a yes or no decision. And that a lot of times is going to depend on what's the risk that you're willing to take of a false positive or being overly aggressive in that response. So whether it's based off of a score or whether it's based off of more context, if you can get to yes or no, you can move to the next step in the playbook. If you can't get to a yes or no because it's like a 50% risk, which is really annoying to deal with, then you're going to have to kind of revert back to a manual triage.
And the last one we've got in here is harking back to the early parts of your slides. What position did you play? And does defense win championships?
So, you mean long story on what position I played. I started off and I was really tall, so I was a forward or center. And then I stopped growing, so I became a point guard when everyone got taller. So it just made me a really baller number 3, wing player with really good ball skills, decent shooting, but able to play in the post. So it was a lot of fun. And then I got older and got worse, and I became a defensive specialist. So I'm going with defense wins championships, yeah.
So back on topic, in terms of optimization, how would you dedicate resources in playbook development? Is it a senior analyst job? What would you actually do?
Yeah,
how would you actually expand on that?
For playbook development, I like to have diversity of opinion. So someone mid-level, someone senior, pair them up together, have them go attack a playbook, and then have a review process. So they create the playbook, and then you have 2 or 3 other people that review it and can comment on it. Not just to say, great job, thanks for the work, but to try to make the nuanced decisions a little bit better or make it simpler as possible. But I like pairing up 2 people if you have the resources to do that because it helps your junior analysts grow. And to the point about alert fatigue, if people are part of the solution, they tend to be more engaged as opposed to, I'm just here to do what I'm told all day. That can help drive improvement within your team morale and team structure as well.
And one that I seem to be tripping over from time and time again, how do you do this when you've only got a microSOC with 1, 1.5, or even only part of a person to fill that function?
Yeah, I think it's even more important when it's a small team. At that point, it's about driving priority with the business. Hey, we've got this many tickets. This is what we need to get to. And either we're going to have to, we need to spend 10% of our time moving to the next level. So I'm only going to allocate, 80, 90% of that resource to daily ticket triage. I will allocate 10% of their time to playbook development and automation and getting ahead. And if the business doesn't buy into that, you've got to show them the same thing. Hey, look, the threat landscape is growing. This is going to be more complex. This is the only approach that we have. And you've got to align with the business. So if you're part of the conversation there, you can drive that. If you're not part of the conversation, then you're going to lead to the alert fatigue, the burnout, some of the challenges that are really inherent. So I'm not trying to say that, that's a silver bullet. There are real challenges that I know everyone's facing.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Jamie. It's been a very thought-provoking and engaging presentation.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Please thank
Jamie.
So we've now got a 5-minute break until the next one, which is the hallmarks of a high-performing SOC. Thank you. That was really good. I really enjoyed that. Hopefully you got at least 3 quality questions out of all that.